I am 73 years old. A few days after Thanksgiving last year, I dropped a 3/8 socket wrench under my workbench in the garage. It hit the concrete and rolled all the way back against the drywall. I stood there looking at it in the shadows, and I realized I had a choice. I could either go inside and ask Linda to come out and pick it up for me, or I could try to kneel down and get it myself. I chose the concrete. The second my right knee bent past a normal standing angle, a sharp, violent, grinding pain shot straight up under my kneecap. It felt like someone had driven a hot wedge of iron right into the joint. I gasped, grabbed the heavy wooden edge of the workbench, and had to pull my entire body weight up using just my arms. I left the wrench on the floor. I walked back into the house dragging my right leg, feeling entirely humiliated in my own garage. I spent 30 years walking the concrete floors of a distribution warehouse. I climbed metal stairs, I carried heavy freight, and I spent 12 hours a day on my feet. When you put that kind of mileage on your body, you just assume that joint pain is the final bill coming due. You think the cartilage is gone, the bones are scraping together, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it except swallow some pills and sit down. I sat in my armchair that night rubbing my knee, convincing myself that my days of working in the garage were over. I was accepting the decline. I was ready to surrender the territory. My daughter Megan came over that weekend. She is an occupational therapist, and she spends her days watching older folks give up their independence because they think their bodies are broken beyond repair. She noticed me limping when I walked to the kitchen. I made the mistake of telling her that my knees were just shot from the warehouse days. She did not coddle me. She sat down at the table and told me about a medical paper she had been reading. It tracked men in their late 60s and 70s who had severe knee pain, the kind of pain where doctors tell you it is bone on bone. But the study showed that over 75% of that pain was not actually coming from the bone. It was coming from the fact that the muscles surrounding the knee had completely shut down. The shock absorbers had rusted away, leaving the joint to take every single ounce of impact. We let our legs get weak, and we blamed the bones for the pain. I spent the next 2 weeks paying attention to how I moved. I treated my own legs like a piece of broken machinery that I needed to diagnose. I realized that my daily routine of just sitting in the house and taking short walks was actively destroying whatever support my knees had left. Walking on a weak joint does not make it stronger. It just grinds it down further. I knew I had to rebuild the scaffolding around my knees, but I could not use heavy weights, and I certainly could not do the things younger men do. I narrowed my recovery down to 5 very specific quiet movements. I started doing them every single day. I am going to tell you exactly what all 5 of these movements are. The first 4 stop the grinding and put the brakes on the damage. But you need to pay close attention to the 5th movement. That last one is the specific action that completely reversed the pain and gave me my life back. The first movement I had to start doing was meant to fix a massive mistake I was making every time I sat down. When you sit in a chair for hours, the large muscle on the front of your thigh simply goes to sleep. It stops holding tension. I had to wake it up without bending the knee and causing that sharp pain. I started doing seated static leg extensions. I would sit on the edge of a firm dining chair, straighten my right leg out in front of me, and pull my toes back toward my shin. Then I would squeeze the muscle on the top of my thigh as hard as I possibly could and hold it there for 10 full seconds. I was not lifting weights. I was just forcing the muscle to remember how to fire. Megan showed me a clinical study that looked at older adults doing these static isometric holds versus people trying to walk off their knee pain. The group doing the static holds reduced the shear force on their knee joints by over 40% in just 6 weeks. By forcing that thigh muscle to tighten and hold, they were literally building a thick protective cable that pulled the kneecap back into its proper track. It made me think of my old neighbor Arthur. Arthur is 76, and he stopped walking his dog last year because his left knee felt loose, like it was going to buckle backward. He bought a heavy brace and just accepted the limp. He thought the joint was destroyed. What he did not know was that his thigh muscle had just vanished. His knee was buckling because there was nothing holding it together. I started doing those static holds every morning while I drank my coffee, rebuilding that front cable. Once I got the front of the leg firing again, I realized I was completely ignoring the back. The second movement I had to add was standing hamstring curls. When you drive a lot or sit in a recliner, the muscles on the back of your legs get stretched out and incredibly weak. Your knee joint is held in balance by the muscles on the front pulling one way and the muscles on the back pulling the other. If the back is weak, the knee gets pulled out of alignment every time you take a step. I started standing in front of the kitchen sink, holding onto the edge of the counter for balance. I would keep my knees close together and slowly lift my right heel up toward the back of my thigh. I would hold it there for 3 seconds, feeling the muscle cramp up and then slowly lower it. I was acting as my own resistance. I read a paper from a university that tracked men over 65 who had severe knee arthritis. The researchers found that a massive imbalance between the front and back of the leg was the primary cause of sudden knee collapses in older men. The men who rebuilt their hamstring strength saw a dramatic drop in daily pain because the knee was finally being supported from both sides. My brother-in-law Robert suffered from this. He spent 40 years driving a delivery truck. Last winter, he stepped off a curb, his hamstring failed to catch the momentum, and his knee hyperextended so badly he had to wear a cast for 2 months. He had no support in the back of his legs. I made sure I did my curls at the sink every single day before breakfast. The third movement forced me to look away from the knee itself and look down at my feet. The mistake I was making was ignoring my ankles. When an older man walks, his ankles get stiff. We shuffle. We do not roll through our feet anymore. When your ankle loses its ability to bend and absorb the shock of the ground, that impact does not just disappear. It travels straight up the shin bone and slams directly into the bottom of the knee joint. I was hammering my own knees with every step I took because my ankles were locked solid. I started doing slow, flat-footed calf raises. I did not stand on the edge of a stair because that puts too much pressure on the Achilles tendon for a man my age. I just stood flat on the kitchen floor, held the counter, and slowly pushed myself up onto the balls of my feet. I held the top for 2 seconds and then lowered my heels back to the linoleum over a count of 4 seconds. The slow downward movement was the most important part. I found a research trial that compared older men with stiff ankles to men with mobile ankles. The men who restored their ankle mobility reduced the impact load on their knees by 30% with every single step. They were giving their body its natural shock absorbers back. A guy I used to work with named Thomas completely lost his ankle mobility after a minor foot surgery. Within a year, his knees were in such agony he could barely walk the aisles at the grocery store. The shock was destroying his joints. I did my calf raises to make sure my knees never had to take that kind of beating again. The fourth movement addressed the way we move through the world. As we get older, we only ever walk straight ahead. We walk to the car, we walk to the mailbox, we walk to the chair. We never move side to side. Because of that, the muscles on the outside of our hips completely waste away. And when the side of your hip gets weak, your knee caves inward toward the other leg every time you put your weight on it. That inward collapse grinds the cartilage down to nothing. I started doing standing side leg raises. I would hold the back of a sturdy chair, keep my body perfectly straight, and slowly lift one leg out to the side. Not very high, just a few inches, until I felt the muscle on the outside of my hip tighten up like a clenched fist. I read a study that looked specifically at older men with medial knee pain, the pain on the inside of the joint. The researchers discovered that lateral hip weakness was the #1 predictor of whether an older man would need a knee replacement. The men who strengthened the outside of their hips forced their legs to step straight, taking the grinding pressure off the inside of the knee. My friend Michael from church had this exact problem. You could see his knees knocking together every time he walked down the aisle. He eventually needed surgery on both legs because he wore the inside of the joints down to the bone. I did my side raises in the living room every afternoon, building the guy wires that kept my legs stepping straight and true. Doing those 4 movements stopped the sharp pains. My knees felt a little more stable when I walked through the house. The deep ache at night started to fade, but I still could not bend down. I still did not trust the joint to hold my weight if I had to lower myself to the ground. I had stopped the bleeding, but I had not rebuilt the engine. I had to find the courage to do the fifth movement. The biggest lie we are told about bad knees is that we should never let our knees travel out over our toes. We are told to keep our legs rigid to protect the joint. But keeping the joint rigid is exactly what starves the tendons of the blood flow they need to heal. I had to force the blood back into the connective tissue around my kneecap. I had to do the one thing that felt completely unnatural. I started walking backward. I went out to the flat concrete of my driveway. I made sure there was nothing I could trip over. I stood looking at the garage door, and I started taking slow, deliberate steps backward. I reached back with my toes, planted the ball of my foot, and then slowly rolled back onto my heel, letting my knee bend out over my toes as it took my weight. It felt incredibly strange at first, but I read a staggering study from a sports medicine journal that tracked men in their 70s who walked backward for just 10 minutes a day. The reverse motion forced the muscles around the knee to act as brakes. It pumped massive amounts of fresh blood directly into the patellar tendon, the thick band of tissue right below the kneecap that usually causes all the pain. The men in the study completely reversed decades of tendon degeneration. They were actively healing the tissue by reversing the load. I did not do 10 minutes. I did 2 minutes a day at first, just dragging my toes backward up the slight incline of the driveway. Then I did 3 minutes. I did it every single morning. I ignored how strange it looked to the neighbors. I focused entirely on the feeling of the blood pushing into the front of my legs, repairing the damage I thought was permanent. The change was not a sudden miracle. You do not undo years of neglect in a weekend. But about 2 months after I started walking backward on that driveway, I was out in the garage. Derek had brought his truck over so we could change the oil. He was looking for the right size filter wrench. I walked over to the bottom drawer of the heavy metal tool chest. I did not think about it. I just bent my knees, squatted straight down, opened the drawer, and stood back up with the tool in my hand. Derek stopped wiping his hands on a rag and just stared at me. He had seen me limping for a year. He knew I had stopped coming out to the garage because of the pain. I stood there holding the metal wrench, feeling the solid ground under my boots, and I realized my knees were completely quiet. There was no grinding. There was no sharp heat. There was just the strong, quiet tension of muscles doing exactly what they were designed to do. When you get to be my age, the things that matter are incredibly simple. I want to be able to get down on the carpet and wrestle with my grandsons without worrying how I'm going to get back up. I want to be able to drop a tool on the concrete floor and know that picking it up is not going to cost me 3 days of pain. I want to walk down the hallway without bracing myself against the wall. You do not have to accept the pain. You do not have to believe that the grinding in your joints is just a life sentence you have to serve. Muscle does not vanish because the calendar turns over, and joints do not have to remain broken. If you rebuild the scaffolding, if you feed the tendons, and if you demand that your body do the work, the strength will return. I am going to head out to the backyard now. The grandchildren left some toys scattered in the grass, and I need to go bend down and pick them up before I mow the lawn. Take care of your legs, put the work in, and do not let anyone tell you that your independence is over. I will be right here if you want to talk again.